Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. In today's seminar this afternoon, our speaker, Dr. Chris Holdridge, is going to be presenting his paper titled Murder in a Quarry, Violent Encounters and Distant Intimacy on a Cape Convict Station. So you have 25 minutes, and then we're going to take a round of questions. Over to you.
So much. Yeah, thanks so much, Charmaine. I'm going to share my screen. I mean, as we have some technical difficulties on the Potchefstroom side, so they're not going to see the images, but I hope they don't mind too much with that. Can you all see the share screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, that is great. Okay. So shortly after lunchtime, and while fellow convicts rested after a hard morning quarrying stone in late October 1846, the Irishman Michael O'Brien murdered the convict onverwacht with a blow to the head from a shovel. O'Brien and the other convicts were then at work building the first hard road between the two oldest colonial towns in the region, Cape Town and Stellenbosch. His actions were motivated, witnesses claimed, by an attempt to silence onverwacht from revealing the details of a botched escape attempt from the convict station in Tyger Valley, east of Cape Town. Now, it's easy to gloss over such violent episodes as isolated or ordinary events within the social worlds of colonial crime and punishment, without delving deeper through examining archival traces to understand the broader context of the political economy of a settler colony. Now, following Carlo Ginzburg and others, a useful approach towards understanding violence and intimacy within these settler colonial encounters is through microhistories of the exceptional normal narrative of a life and an event. Now, microhistory concerns itself with the ever smaller and more intimate snatches of history. It does not reduce scale that enables discussion of intimacy, but rather a focus on the unexpected, unscripted, or unrehearsed within social interactions that links and even transcends our artificial conceptual divides between the local and the global. So something I've tried to do with this paper, and it's going to appear soon in the journal Africa, but my final edits are in about a week's time to the editors. And what I've tried to do this paper is consider the paradox, the confined spaces of penal institutions in Southern Africa in this colonial context here, read against the global mobilities and distance inherent within empires. So I first will place Michael O'Brien's crime, or the murder, within the wider socioeconomic context of property, crime, and punishment within the Cape Colony, and how this is inseparable from global connections. Then I'll explain the role of intimacy and violence within the space of the penal system. And lastly, the murder itself will come under the spotlight using court records and letters to analyze the narrative uncertainty of O'Brien's global life leading up to the murder. So places of convict labor and criminal internment in Africa are well-known sites of violence perpetrated by the colonial state, whether political exile on Robben Island or the segregated prisons that punish the behavior of Africans deemed to have challenged or broken colonial laws. These political technologies of incarceration in Africa have long genealogies, stretching back to jails inside coastal forts, the bodily chains of slavery and slave lodgings, and the rudimentary lockups of early colonial conquest before the adoption of more modern 20th century prison buildings and systems of punishment and reform. Now, as often the poor who bore the brunt of structural violence more globally. I'm also talking in the context of the global north and the birth of the prison to manage bodies, minds, social relations, and indeed labor, whether in the bridewell, the workhouse, the asylum, or the prison. And this is very much a global phenomenon, although the prison can be overemphasized in terms of the modernization of crime and punishment systems. Our carceral histories remain fairly underexplored in the pre-industrial Southern Africa. I'm talking before the mineral revolution. Recent scholarship has sought to connect the Cape Colony to global circuits of exile and convict transportation. whether the traffic of convicted people or the circulation of ideas around policies and practices of punishment. Now, what I'm showing you here is just a broader sense of how important, not just in the British Empire, but in other empires, and even we include Russia within that, around convict flows and exile and transportation as a form of punishment here. This is internal and sub-circuits that are regional, such as the one I'm talking about here, internally within the Cape Colony, or from one colony to another, or they're quite transoceanic from one end, perhaps Britain and Ireland, through to Australia. But this is certainly something that stretches beyond just the British Empire. So there's long histories around this. As a broader conception of something that interests me here, beyond this paper, is how Britain might have abandoned some of these sub-imperial circuits. So in the 1840s, particularly indigenous Khoikhoi in the Cape, among others, were sent off to Australia, transported, sometimes as deserters from mounted cavalry. But that this systems of using crime and punishment become much more local and sophisticated in its means of, as a mechanism of colonial control and coercion, particularly with expanding settler frontiers and the violence that entailed. So that broader context aside, and if we look at this map here just briefly in a sense here, is that in the 1840s, there is a shift towards reforming the mind of convicts through much more utilitarian systems of convict reform, including Christian instruction and lessons in literacy, but also systems that rewarded good behavior. But this is all in terms of a framework of viewing a particular political economy of order, that those who had committed crimes, the majority of these are property crimes, have challenged colonial laws in a system that is increasingly, through Master and Servants Acts, in a post-emancipation colony, which had slavery until 1838, is finding ways to use a criminal justice system to not just reform an idea of a criminal, but more specifically of ideas of property crime as emblematic of particularly laborers straying from a script of obedience to the labor relations, particularly in an agricultural economy at this time. So it becomes a lot more racialized, but it's until only about the 1860s that there's actually segregation in prison. So this is very interesting that these are individuals and convicts from all sorts of backgrounds, whether they're Irish, white. Racial markers are a bit in flux in the post-emancipation colony, but there's all sorts of descriptions here, including from the eastern frontier, from the Amakosa, who all are mixed in this space of convict labor. Now, Michael O'Brien's crimes and those of his fellow convicts occurred within a wider social and economic context inseparable from its global connections. Cape Town's the largest city and capital of colony with 24,000 inhabitants. It's also a crossroads bridging the Atlantic and Indian Ocean world, including ships with convicts making their way around the Cape. Immigrants, settlers, and sojourners thus entered this colonial fray. Some of them who were contemporaries might have labeled the laboring poor, those in search of economic opportunities beyond the rural poverty or urban squalor of Britain and Ireland. So Michael O'Brien falls within this category. Racial distinctions, then emergent within the Cape Colony's post-emancipation era, can best be seen as in a period of flux. O'Brien's life demonstrates the ways in which shifting and solidifying settler legal regimes over property and the punishment of property crime sat uneasily next to settler assumptions that colonial crime was predominantly perpetrated by Black subjects. Now, 6 months prior to this murder, and I will get onto the murder details in a moment, on the 4th May 1846, and armed with a knife, the Irish bricklayer, which was his profession at the time, the Irish bricklayer Michael O'Brien cut, wounded, and hamstrung a horse belonging to the local retail dealer Thomas Venn in the division of Stellenbosch. The sentence was 5 years of hard labor in chains. O'Brien's crime of maiming and killing a horse and thus damaging property was not uncommon. One could argue that all property crimes were intimate crimes against the person, as property crimes sometimes involved home invasion, or at the very least caused damage to an asset of the owner. Particularly in a settler colony, these crimes were punished fairly harshly and became increasingly racialized in the way criminal justice systems operated as the centuries would progress. Destruction of property, in this case, Michael O'Brien cutting and wounding and hamstringing a horse, could be an attack on status or an act of revenge, or perhaps an act of desperation motivated by poverty. But the social outlook on the causes of crime is largely accepted by historians who attribute the harshness of sentences for property crimes to the immediate threat to the centrality of private property and thus personal status or worth within mercantilist and later capitalist economic systems. So this is certainly something that's been noted even by historians in the global north. So this crime against property, against a horse, was thus a possible metonym for physical attack on the property owner's person. More broadly, the mobility, property, labor, colonialism, and criminal justice were entwined in this post-emancipation context. A slate of legislation against the indigenous Khoi and also former slaves oscillated between liberal humanitarian pressure for improved labor rights and calls by landowners and farmers for increased labor control. So part of this as well is in a broader context of infrastructure projects within the colony. John Montagu, who arrives as colonial secretary in the Cape from what's then Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, imports a lot of those experiments in convict labor and reform from Australia through to the Cape. These convict stations are thus building roads and mountain passes to make the transportation of produce, the communication of letters, much more effective, and particularly in this context of the hard road that's been constructed, it's cutting the journey time from Cape Town to Stellenbosch to several hours rather than a full day, because of the sand dunes in the Cape Flats. So this whole broader context of infrastructure, coercion and control within the criminal justice system, this are so intertwined as disciplinary technologies here. And so I do want to just talk briefly about these intimate spaces of the convict system before then proceeding into the escape and the murder and trial. So convict stations were a mechanism to correct and reform those who had strayed from the coercion of settler labor regimes through crime, but were in turn also sites for cordial and violent intimacies that emerged within these spaces of confinement, not just between the convicts, but also the overseers, guards, and the superintendents, between the convicts themselves. Now, there might be a particular illusion of order that John Montagu, as colonial secretary, perhaps wished to reflect within the colonial archive here, in what he termed close and merciful watchfulness. These ledgers of convict behavior, monthly reports, carefully done architecture of the prison barracks, can give a sense of almost Foucauldian perfection, of an illusion of an ideal form of criminal justice. And this is obviously one of the important things as a historian, is to see through this, to try and read through some of these silences. And there's some aspects, particularly around the voices of some other convicts, which I can't fully get behind. I welcome some questions. I do have some material regarding petitions and that, particularly even the convict Onverwacht who was murdered. But what you can do with these documents is you can see elements of horizontal relations that happen between convicts and the overseers and guards that reveals quite a messier picture than even the convict superintendent Short, who sketched this perhaps in his own time, perhaps to impress John Montague, who's consuming these reports of what the convict barracks looks like. I don't doubt that there was some element of order here, but it gives a sense that this pulpit in the background for where sermons and lessons in literacy, where musters would have taken place, the careful clockwork of waking up at particular hours, going to work on a quarry and returning, which are all described and shown in documentary form, but also in visual form through this watercolor sketch here. You can certainly see at least a move from previous concern around crime and punishment, which is a lot more disorderly, where convicts were visible in the public, not wearing particular uniforms, and that sense of a lack of discipline is jarring with the increasingly bureaucratized colonial state. And this is certainly one element of that here. So one needs to read beyond this illusion of order here. Now, the intimacy and order, care and discipline of the convict system resembled in some ways the austere management of a mission station, complete with the lessons inculcating hard work and industry and encouraging religious devotion and moral correction, as well as teaching reading and writing. And certainly evident in this sketch here. In relations between convicts and their jailers, there's evident tension with surveillance and scheduled tasks of the convict system. This tension was most apparent within the chain gang, comprising the most hardened convicts subject to stricter disciplinary measures. Onverwacht, who O'Brien would later murder in October 1846, was on the chain gang for all of that year. In January, Onverwacht used insolent expressions, the language in the records, against an overseer, stole bread from the convict Adonis, and was found with unmarked trousers in his possession. In May, he was caught gambling on a Sunday. In June, he sold a stolen knife, and in September, he stole a tin from another convict. All these offenses resulted in between 1 and 8 days solitary confinement on rice water. So the idealized version of convict discipline did not always match this reality on the ground. And it's perhaps interesting to consider the conversations that might have taken place, the gestures, the forms of motivation that explain this perhaps hidden economy of exchange, of stealing items, which are happening here, and perhaps some friendships or elements of distrust that might have occurred. And this all led up on 24th October 1846 to 9 convicts from the Tiger Valley Convict Station escaping, making off with a musket, a bayonet, scabbard, and 2 pistols from startled sentries. A convict struck 1 sentry on the head and in turn was stabbed in the chest by the sentry. 3 convicts were soon after captured, and several more from the chain gang would likely have escaped if the overseer Tyre had not blocked their path, whereupon he was attacked with sticks in a confused mass before the superintendents and others arrived to assist and secure the convicts inside the barracks. So among the men who failed to escape was Michael O'Brien and his accomplices Craig and Onverwacht, the latter of whom he would murder 5 days later in the Quarry. And it's interesting to think more broadly around these narratives of some of these convicts who are trying to escape. And I do see, from trying to dig deeper and follow up some of these names, one of the escapees from the Tiger Valley Convict Station, Rita Philander, had 9 years prior submitted a memorial to the Cape Governor in 1836, requesting a spot of waste crown land, as he was, a quote in his memorial, a poor bastard having no ground upon which he can permanently settle, and who is compelled to lead a wandering life with his cattle. It's obviously narrated in a language to fit expectations of officials rather than his own self-description. The term bastard has a different meaning then. It's more to do with those who have mixed racial heritage in the colony, and is a self-identifying term. The memorial clearly played to colonial stereotypes around itineracy, and especially in the context of slave abolition, it reveals the important connection between how alienation from land led to economic precarity. The violence, even the colonial frontier, framed colonial understandings of crime, often perhaps as an excuse, as a safety valve to transport or convict those, particularly Amakosa, as convicts in systems which particularly some of the convicts might not have agreed with those framings of what was a crime. For many, it would have been possibly seen as resistance or a means of just survival in harsh economic context of increasing master-servant labor restrictions. Now, in the brief time I have, I do want to just talk a bit about this murder and about how it has some global connections. So on 28th October 1846, O'Brien had murdered his fellow convict in the Quarry. Now, O'Brien struck him on the head with a spade or shovel and then attempted a blow on another convict, Craig, of his other accomplices, who evaded the blow and ran shouting, "For God's sake, save us." 5 days later, Onverwacht would succumb to his injuries and die. When questioned immediately after the murder by the overseer of convicts then on duty, O'Brien was defiant. Ordered to sit down, he initially refused, and when threatened with a shot from the overseer's pistol, O'Brien responded with "blow away." This is clearly quite an individual who has very little fear. But there's other elements here which are fascinating around the dynamics of violence and intimacy beyond the events of a crime. It poses questions around why he would commit such an act. What had caused such an acute act of violence perpetrated by a convict who clearly knew the other inmates confined in imprisonment, men who ate, worked, slept, joked, and prayed together. Most likely cause was that failed escape I spoke about a week prior, when 6 convicts had managed to escape, and the alleged betrayal of O'Brien by the convict Craig and Onverwacht, who revealed him as the ringleader. O'Brien, they alleged, had plotted to cut the throats of the superintendent short and the overseer Tyre, a charge he denied, since these men had, quote, shown him the greatest kindness. O'Brien might have gotten a lengthened sentence. Some of his accomplices received additional 2-year sentences and 60 lashes. O'Brien admitted that he brooded over the affair in which he was innocent until his better judgment gave way to a violent excitement and then a moment of madness. Now, this claim to madness is quite interesting, and I will return to it in a moment. But there's perhaps something more interesting around this, in that he was also, O'Brien, suspected before even the escape and murder to have been an escaped convict from Australia, particularly New South Wales. I've gone through several of the records. There's so many Michael O'Briens, I can't pin down exactly who he is in the records, which are digitized and have quite storied accounts around all sorts of crime and punishment of these particular individuals. Michael O'Brien, though, was found to have the marks on his body of striations on his back, which are usually the sign of transported convicts. The stories perhaps he was telling, there might be things beyond the documents which might have given clues to him being escaped. He might have let loose some elements of these stories before even his conviction. And his defense here of madness is one that seems to dominate here. In the court records, there's little concern of this being a capital crime, of him being an escaped convict. That seems to escape some of the focus of the trial. One of the witnesses in the stand, Philip, who had lived together for a year with O'Brien, caught at least 5 or 6 episodes where O'Brien had gotten a kind of fit, as if he had a twin in his head, and then he ran away. It seems quite possible that he might have had elements of mental illness, but at this time, this is not well theorized, even medically. It's possible through his episodes of drunkenness, he might have had delirium tremens, that's what it would be then known, mental ailments from excessive consumption of alcohol. But Dr. Lang, the surgeon at the convict station, does note that O'Brien had conducted his own defense with the trial of the attack and maiming of the horse in May 1846, including cross-examining the witnesses. This is clearly somebody with the mental capacity of the court to consider to have the mental capacity to not have been mad. So it is possible that he might have had elements of mental illness, but it seems quite dubious considering his conduct even during his time in the convict station, even his defense in the trial, to actually claim insanity. But I've used it to mitigate his sentence. But I'm going to end with this last sort of aspect here, and then move towards some conclusions, because I'm mindful of the time remaining. So, O'Brien claimed to have traveled and lived in the Pacific, not as a convict. And these are in the memorials for his claim for clemency, and particularly mercy from the conviction of death. He was found guilty. He claimed to have been an assistant to missionaries, and to have played a role within Christian Concern to prevent injury to some of these missionaries. O'Brien claimed that a blow to his head had not been caused by drunkenness, but first in 1829 through fracturing his skull after falling off a cliff pursued by the indigenous inhabitants on the island of Malaita in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, and secondly by a Maori club in 1836 while defending the life of the Reverend John Williams in the Bay of Islands, New Zealand. Since at least 1833, O'Brien wrote, "Several years ago, resided in the islands of the South Seas and was of the utmost service to the British missionaries settled in that quarter, whom he assisted in the translation of the Holy Scriptures into the Tonga and New Zealand dialects. He also rendered them his gratuitous assistance in his trade as a mason and building churches in various parts of Polynesia." Now, there's a problem with this narrative. It's an entire fiction. I've considered and looked through what his claims are, read them against what the historical record knows, and Reverend John Williams did exist. He died in 1839, where he was murdered on the island of Vanuatu by the indigenous peoples, which has become a storied narrative or fiction, partly embraced within the British public in these colonial fictions by the success of Reverend John Williams' narrative of missionary enterprises in the South Sea Islands, published in 1837. So it's possible that this narrative, this mixture between fact and fiction, was heard by O'Brien at a sermon, possibly read in a newspaper. These accounts are circulated in excerpts and that, and he weaves this together to create a sense of turning the narrative, his own narrative on its head. He might have committed violence, but in turn, the worst violence in his framing for humanitarian sympathy and the sympathy of the settler public was one where violence against settlers, against missionaries, against the idea of a civilizing mission was the worst kind of violence. His efforts to save the lives of missionaries in New Zealand and in Tonga were therefore weaved into this narrative to show that ultimately his own efforts to prevent violence against missionaries and settlers was a counterweight, a means in which O'Brien's murder of Unverwacht needed to be seen as part of a broader story, one which O'Brien might have erred in the murder of his fellow convict, but he deserved clemency because of his altruistic story of heroism. You can see these type narratives weaved in even with individuals here, like the Reverend John Williams, which become such problematic but important mechanisms for the glorification of empire, stories of heroism. We think of David Livingstone as well here, depicted in artwork, which could often formalize ideas of indigenous barbarity and settler or colonial right and bringing of civilization and Christianity. So this morality tale is certainly being woven in and drawn upon, and it's becoming increasingly prevalent in written and visual sources here. This doesn't work. O'Brien is sentenced to death. It's not a public spectacle because by this time it is seen as problematic in the racial order to display the hanging of a white man. This is an illustration from Lady Anne Barnard's sketches from 50 years earlier. I can't go into some of the complexities in the foreground of the African peoples there in labor walking about. There's lots one could say perhaps around the racialized political order of the Cape here. But certainly, to conclude, is there are, I think, far more interesting ways rather than to fit someone like O'Brien into criminological categories of a sociopath or necessarily being mad, or trying to fit him into these neat categories, I think is missing the point of what I'm trying to do, and I've tried to do with this paper. What I'm more interested in is the ways in which, on the one hand, these narratives of distant intimacy could elicit sympathy, since they're familiar to settler audiences who themselves maintain or had lost connection with family and friends and further shore. Secondly, I've shown, at least through this microhistory of a murder, ways in which the local and the global became so entangled. It's very possible and likely that O'Brien and any of these globe-trotting individuals would have been interacting and conversing with fellow convicts, some other, who had also been displaced, but in a smaller scale from other parts of the colony. But yet, in the smaller space of a convict station, or even being at labor on a quarry, these are spaces of a smaller scale which were incredibly intimate because of the social interaction. They did not map onto what the colonial state often tries to envision of a perfect, idealized, almost Foucauldian system of order and discipline. Now, in examining O'Brien's the murder, the appropriate question is not to ask whether O'Brien's narrative of a seaborne life of mission work in the Pacific was true, but it's within these facts and fictions and the lesions between the two, the stories that are told, that are perhaps the most interesting here. One wonders what narratives convicts whispered to each other as they toiled in the quarry and upon the construction of roads and mountain passes, and what effective worlds existed within these coercive spaces. What is certain with hindsight is that emergent total institutions such as the prison, the mine compound, and the concomitant surveillance of labor that held such regimes of power together within Southern Africa in this context would become increasingly racialized and a central mechanism within the capitalist economy of Southern Africa in the 20th century. I think this case study in closing here shows a moment in the 1840s where colonial officials perhaps were most concerned to make this a capital crime because of that this had been the murder of a white man on a black subject in ways that could undo ideas of respect, respectability, and order, particularly in a post-emancipation economy. I'm going to end there because I'm aware we need some time for questions, but thank you for listening. I see it's currently 22.
Yes. Thank you so much, Chris. That was interesting. I think colleagues have a lot of questions about Michael O'Brien. He was such a fascinating man. I find him very fascinating because it seems like he led different life. So how was his life? Before I asked people to ask questions, how was his life in Australia? Because he escaped, right? Do we know his life in Australia? Do he have family? What kind of person was he?
All I can tell is through what's shown in memorials and the records there. And there's also some of the other convicts who, if they have a memorial they've written, sometimes I see there's a letter from a sister of one convict, Jepta, who's claiming he didn't steal the sheep, which he's convicted for, that this was actually a misunderstanding. So the trick is, the problem is around silences. So some individuals I can tell a little bit more about.
Yes.
O'Brien, I don't know which O'Brien it was. Okay. I can see a range, I think about 7 or 8 O'Briens who might map up to the dates for when he was a transported convict. Yeah. I'm almost certain he was, because of descriptions of the scars on his back, and also there are a few other clues in the historical record. I do know the claims, but we don't know this is true or not, that he has an adopted daughter in the Cape. Interesting. That he has a family that he had left behind an island when he was transported as well, he claims not transported as a convict, but when he left them to work with the missionaries. Yeah. And so these family kinship links he does draw upon. But being able to sketch out his time in Australia, the lines between fact and fiction, I can't get beyond them in the historical record. So it's a lot more down to the perhapses and maybes of what might have occurred. Yeah. I can tell you something around how, in general, convicts in the Australian colonies, New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, experienced their lives, but not on the individual level for him.
What a fascinating character. Colleagues, do you have any questions? I'll take 3 for this round. I'm also mindful of time. We have 18 minutes before we conclude. Do you have any questions, comments for Dr. Holdridge? I see Laura. Do we have 2 more people? So we have 3 in this round. Or you can start, Laura, while the other colleagues are thinking about their questions.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Chris. And hi, everyone. There are a couple of us here who've zoomed in together from Mafeking. What a fascinating story that you tell, Chris. I have, if I may, Charmaine, I have 2 questions. Tell me to stop if you need me to. The first is about the kind of context in which race is in flux and definitions of race are in flux. And while you say on the one hand, this is a period where it's kind of not 100% clear who's black, who's white, who falls into which category, you do seem pretty certain that O'Brien is being classified as white. I wonder if you could tell us, as an Irishman, and we know that, I don't know exactly how this plays out in South Africa, but in a broader context, to be Irish isn't clearly to be white, until quite late in the 20th century at various points in the world. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about O'Brien's racial makeup and why he is so clearly white and why his victim is so clearly black in the eyes of the state at the time. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
And then my second question is about the category of intimacy. So violence seems like a very clear, and useful description for what's going on. And I'm quite convinced by your use of the category of intimacy, but I wonder what it's doing for your argument. In some ways I was thinking as you were describing it, you referred to kind of distant intimacy. You speak about the spaces that are existing in these, on these chain gangs and in these prisons. But I thought at times maybe intimacy isn't the best kind of category to describe the nature of the relations that are going on between people. At times seems to be claims making to kind of an idea about a supposed racial order. I'm not sure exactly, revenge seems to be part of what's motivating O'Brien's actions against An Verwacht. Could you speak a little bit about what intimacy is doing as the contrast to the violence, which is clearly what's going on? Thanks very much.
Okay, good.
Can I also take another question?
You can.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I see another hand from Gerald. Prof, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Charmaine. Hi, Chris. It was a wonderful paper. Even though I missed the start of it, apologies. Just a quick thing. I was fascinated by your discussion of the claims of madness as defense, because, I've done a lot of work on 16th and 17th century court cases, and it's something that you find a lot in that as well. But what makes it interesting is the link with religion. It's almost as if defendants knew in my period and your period, the kind of the soft spot of the authority. So in the 18th century, you have almost always the lower class white people like sailors and soldiers claiming, things like the devil made me do it. I went mad because of the devil. But what fascinates me is there are also a couple of cases where you have slaves saying something similar, even though they may not necessarily be religious, because they know it is something that will play on the authorities, weakness or something. And I wonder if you think, excuse me, I'm not so familiar with your period's, criminal history, whether that is something similar, if you find this a lot, that madness and it's not my fault, I was kind of under force or something. Thank you.
That's 3 questions. Do you want to take one from Ndobeko?
Sure. So I'll respond first to the one which I'm trying to transport my mind back, Laura, to what you were asking around race. Should you just remind me just very briefly so I can
I was just asking about kind of O'Brien's racial identity and his Irishness, and in the period there's so much racial questions in flux, how that might shape what's happening.
So more specifically, the actual word used, and these are being categorized, and it depends on the idiosyncrasies of the convict superintendent doing the records. But they're using the term European, interestingly, and there is a whole range of categories. The word colored isn't used yet, whether it's a self-identifier or a word by the state. The term bastard, mixed bastard, all the pejoratives, something like bushman, all being thrown in here, but there's so many different categories in that, and that's would make sense, but that's understandable for historians who are familiar with the period, and that it starts to solidify in several years later. But with regards to the Irishness of O'Brien, it doesn't seem to reflect a sense of racial prejudice from the officials in the records. It might very well have resulted, and at least what we know in the Cape, with some of the Irish. There weren't that many, but some shiploads earlier in 1817, 1823, had often resulted on more class solidarities and intermarriage even among and across racial boundaries between the Irish. I don't know enough about O'Brien's social life and interactions before his conviction here in the Cape Colony, but it's very likely he would have seen himself perhaps within a measure of not necessarily identifying himself strictly according to ideas of being white. I think we can sometimes overemphasize that, and the different registers of prejudice, and particularly the Irish, are often viewed as not quite white in many places, particularly by the English, partly because of some of them being Catholic. There's a whole politics around that. But O'Brien, on the other hand, is very much used as a racial epithet. I didn't use it in the paper, but he calls, and excuse my language here, but I'm quoting, he refers to Onverwacht as a black bugger. And the complex analysis of racial slurs here, I can't get into in a moment here, but it's certain in this moment of his description to the authorities, he's framing himself in a very racialized sense, almost in a sense of, right, sure, I committed a murder, but it was against a black man. And not just a black man, somebody he's willing to claim in a sense of perhaps recognition, racial or racist recognition, as a black bugger. And so this problematic sort of language here is redolent within the trial. And certainly in the way he's presenting himself with that, he relies on these racial tropes of perhaps we describe of whiteness here to make his crime seem somehow justifiable. On the question of intimacy and violence, there's the theoretical side I removed from the spoken version of this paper. So there's a lot of work done by a whole lot of individuals, Amanda Nettelbeck, I've even relied on Anne-Laura Stoller and a few others, even Pierre Bourdieu's ideas of symbolic violence. And I wove in an idea around intimacy, not as amorous or not necessarily one showing love or affection. Historians have theorized intimacy much more in spaces which the lines between intimacy and violence become so intertwined, and particularly in places of colonial encounter, whether it's in the household or in spaces of warfare and contestation over territory. These are places where the lines between intimacy and violence are incredibly blurred. And so theoretically, it's a bit problematic to necessarily see intimacy in the lens of necessarily just affection or that sort of emotional history of emotions side in that. I use the term distant intimacy more generally in the paper also to consider the ways in which the narrative, which O'Brien falls back on, of him being in the Pacific, him having shown sort of this sense of care through saving the lives of missionaries, the story of him having a daughter, which I mentioned now, who's adopted, and kin who elsewhere somehow link him to be to have a humane sort of element, a human element to him. So this distant intimacy operating through the distance, through narratives that he has blood kin, or those he claims to have lived with missionaries located elsewhere, or somehow his go-to link in terms of kinship and narrative, which he refers to get clemency. So there's a paradox when I use that term distant intimacy in this sense here. The scales between coercion and care, between the local and the global. And I couldn't get fully behind them in the paper here, but I just want to flag those points where I don't think it is as useful perhaps to see intimacy and violence as so separate phenomenon. They become incredibly entangled. On the question of claims to madness, in response to your question, Gerald, I haven't seen as much around religion. I know in the early modern period, I think of, sure, there's so many examples. There's so many scholars who've even used, as you'd be aware, looking at court records in early modern Europe or in the Dutch Cape or elsewhere, where these narratives of madness become entangled with cosmologies of sort of religious allegory. Like it almost turns into a morality tale, even more than just trying to get, as you describe, a sort of a soft spot for authorities, of an element that's the church, and therefore religion, is somehow the welfare state, to take care of somebody who is perhaps insane or indolent, poor, in need of shelter, which the state dislodges the role of the church here. Certainly, in terms of religion, the lines between if you see it as political technology of these convict stations compared to a mission station, there are key differences, obviously, but that seems to have some sort of effect. But I don't see religion coming much into his memorials and narratives, even in the claims of madness. Not much reference to God even, which is curious and interesting. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that more broadly, but there does seem to be, maybe as one side to this, there's who I studied with when I was doing PhD studies in Australia, James Dunk, his work on madness in early colonial Australia at the University of Sydney. It's a book, Bedlam at Botany Bay. He argues very much in the context of how the lives of individuals who are transported are often, and particularly property crime, those from Britain and Ireland who make their way to Australia, the first generation here, are quite traumatized by poverty. I think in many ways, which you can see in even Southern Africa and settler colonial settings. And the violence that can be perpetrated by systems of capitalism, of want, of not being able to put food on the table, has huge ramifications for family instability. Janet McAlmon at the University of Melbourne has done recent work on this. and tracing, looking generationally, how the lines between drunkenness behind almost what we would now call trauma have huge impact on even the mental health of convicts. We know that some of these systems could be quite cruel, even though they're packaged as caring, including with the flogging, solitary confinement, and it is quite possible that O'Brien might be seen more clearly the reasons for the madness for that. But yeah, I'm not sure that's fully answered your question, Gerald, but there's a broader context perhaps to that. It's not just an excuse, but might actually explain a general trend by many transported convicts around mental illness and trauma, which could actually explain that this is a genuine excuse, not just something made up for sympathy.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Thank you, colleagues, for the questions. We move on to the final round. Do you still want to ask? Okay, no, we're sorted. Do we have any more? There's a chat.
Elise, hand up.
Oh, Elise, Prof. Elise.
Thank you very much, Charmaine, and also Chris, for a very interesting discussion and the information that you've shared. I've got maybe two questions. So you suggest that historians, in their approach to the past, on people's actions, should be more sensitive or considerate to understand people's actions due to their personal past experiences, which means allowing for a particular history to unfold as it in this case did. Then my second question is, how do you view the formal conceptual use of empathy versus intimacy in the historian's way of looking at history, doing history? Thank you.
Just for clarity, by empathy, my empathy as an historian?
Yes. We in the past really also used the word empathy quite a lot, having kind of an understanding of whatever, whoever in the past. How do you view the two words if you weigh them against each other?
Okay, right. I'll start with the point around empathy, around intimacy. I'm not fully sure what referred to there, but certainly in social and cultural histories, we've been certainly sensitive to that. I do think there's limits in the colonial archive. I do rely on Anna Ristola's work, and the gendered work of someone like Antoinette Burton, who argue, and there's some interesting ways here. Think of Stoller uses the Dutch Colonial Archive in her book from about 15 years ago on this. And there's an interesting way on intimacy as, I suppose, an imperfect surveillance of the officials looking at records. A lot of historians have used these colonial records without realizing the extent to which officials might have very much known the individuals they're talking about, whether it's missionary accounts even, that this intimacy is revealing of particular silences and packaging of narratives that are written for the particular audience of the colonial estate, and these are public records, and these are often not being seen as sensitively viewed as filled with the silences. How do we identify the ideas of emotions and thoughts and actions and agency of the people being described, whether colonial subjects or whoever else is contained within these records? And so the sensitivity to archives as a field, as a space which is imperfect, as one which is incredibly sort of coercive in the state, but on the other hand, filled with things like memorials and letters. What are the limits of what we can understand from this or not? I think sometimes there's a danger as historians where writing in the third person gives a sense of omniscience, and a danger even at the worst sort of state of echoing the language and reasoning of the colonial state. So I was trying to cut against that, but there are limits to what I can do with the sources here. The terms of empathy and intimacy of an historian, sure, I think I'll argue this perhaps in an unexpected way here. I'm certainly, through this narrative, not trying to create a sense of empathy for someone like O'Brien. But I'm certainly putting on a bit of a Marxist hat here in terms of thinking more broadly around the political economy. Sometimes social historians have been so focused on legislation, on broader policies, on broader patterns of structures, particularly say in the 1970s and 80s, that they lost touch with some of the more fine-grained details of everyday life and interaction here. Something which I think is fairly apparent and broader here is, I think we can sometimes think of a criminal justice system as being natural, these crimes as being theft, and theft is bad, in very simple ways that don't realize these categories have been invented by a colonial state as a form of control to forward land and labor regimes within the colony. So there's an oscillation, I suppose, between the very fine detail consideration that these were living human beings who suffered under broader systems of coercion and political economies of coercion. So I don't think one can have the proper empathy as historians if you don't pay attention to both scalar levels here. The very sort of clear element of identifiable individuals, as we can see within the colonial records, despite all the perhapses and maybes of the
I just want to check if the others online have also, Chris is frozen for you.
We're still hearing you, Laura.
Okay, my connection is good, but clearly his isn't. If we can just wait 2 seconds to see if he's, I bet you they've just been load shed. So usually it takes just a minute or two to get up and running. That we have just gone 2 o'clock which is when the seminar ends. But if you can just bear with us for 2 minutes, and if he doesn't come back, then I think we will have to close it. But let's just wait to see for a second. Yes, I can actually see that they've fallen off the call now completely. So I'm going to step in and say sorry to everyone. But yeah, this is the reality of load shedding, and we'll end the seminar there, even though he was mid-sentence. Thanks very much to everyone for coming. Our next seminar is on the 22nd of March, and in fact our presenter is online at the moment, Majuta. More information will be forthcoming about a week ahead of time about Majuta's presentation about Lucas Mangope and Pan-Swanism. That'll be held physically in Mafeking, but as always online for those who are not able to join us physically. So apologies again for the abrupt ending, and thank you very much to everyone for attending. We'll see you in a few weeks at the next seminar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Laura. So also thank you to Chris. Keep well. Bye.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.